They served their country. Then they became killers. What happens when America's heroes become America's most wanted? When the uniform comes off and the monster comes out? Today we're diving into the darkest chapter of military service. Veterans who went from defending freedom to sitting on death row. From Vietnam vets haunted by PTSD to decorated soldiers living double lives, we're counting down every U.S. veteran executed since the death penalty returned. Their military records, their horrific crimes, their final meals, their last words before the state delivered its final verdict, starting with the only soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. Case 1. The Forgotten Soldier, Eddie Slovic, executed January 31, 1945. He wasn't a killer. His crime wasn't murder. But Private Eddie Slovic holds a grim distinction: the only U.S. soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. Drafted in 1944, Slovic was terrified of combat. Assigned to the 28th Infantry Division in France, amidst the bloody Hurtgen Forest campaign, his fear consumed him. After being separated from his unit, he wandered, eventually writing a note in which he admitted that he would desert again if sent back to the front lines. He turned himself in, expecting a prison sentence. But the Army, desperate to stem a tide of desertions during the brutal winter of 1944-45, made an example. Slovic's court-martial was swift. Despite pleas for clemency, General Dwight D. Eisenhower confirmed the death sentence. On a frozen morning in Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, France, Slovic, 24, was tied to a post. His final request was to write to his wife. His last meal went untouched. His final words, spoken to the chaplain as the blindfold was applied: "They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army. They're shooting me for the bread and chewing gum I stole when I was 12 years old." At 10:04 a.m., a firing squad of 12 riflemen executed Private Eddie Slovic. A soldier killed by soldiers, a stark symbol of military justice at its most absolute. Case 2. The Green Berets Fall, David Paul Hammer, executed April 22, 1996. David Paul Hammer wore the Green Beret, a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, trained, disciplined, elite. But after his service, a darkness took hold. In 1988, while serving a sentence for kidnapping and robbery in an Oklahoma prison, Hammer committed an act of unspeakable brutality. He lured his cellmate, Andrew Marty, a 23-year-old serving time for auto theft, into a false sense of security. Then, he strangled Marty with an electrical cord, beat him with a cinder block, and slit his throat. The motive? Allegedly, Marty snored. Hammer was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death under federal law for murder in a prison. He became a notorious jailhouse lawyer, filing endless appeals and even attempting suicide on death row. Oklahoma carried out the sentence. His final meal request was specific: a double cheeseburger, French fries, onion rings, and a Dr. Pepper. Strapped to the gurney in McAlester, Oklahoma, Hammer offered no apology to Marty's family. His final words were chillingly detached: "I'm sorry it had to be this way. I deserve this. I hope this brings peace to the Marty family. I'm ready, Warden." The lethal injection flowed at 9:10 p.m. Case 3. The Nameless Terror, James Edward Smith, executed June 22, 1990. James Edward Smith served in the crucible of Vietnam. What he saw, what he did, marked him. Back home in Texas, the war never left. In 1977, Houston became his battlefield. Smith broke into the apartment of 21-year-old Jennifer Soto under the guise of needing to use the phone. What followed was a prolonged nightmare. He robbed her, raped her repeatedly, and then, in a final act of depravity, stabbed her to death. He left her body for her roommate to find. Smith was captured, convicted, and sentenced to death. He spent 13 years on death row. Texas carried out the sentence. Smith requested no last meal. He offered no grand statement. His final words were brief and offered little solace. "I'd like to say I love my family, and I'm sorry. That's it." At 12:19 a.m., James Edward Smith, a Vietnam veteran, was pronounced dead by lethal injection. The war within him ended on a gurney. Case 4. The War Hero's Crime, John E. Bennett, executed December 11, 1997. John Bennett presented a jarring contradiction. A U.S. Army veteran decorated for his service in Korea, he returned home only to descend into a life marked by violence and sexual deviance. His crimes culminated in the horrific 1982 abduction and murder of 17-year-old Helen Schuch in Virginia. Bennett, posing as a stranded motorist, lured the teenager, raped her, strangled her with her own belt, and dumped her body. Convicted and sentenced to death, Bennett spent 15 years on death row. Virginia executed him by electrocution, the last person to die in the state's electric chair. His final meal was declined. His final words, directed to Helen Schuch's family, were an attempt at remorse. "I am sorry for the pain I've caused. I hope my death brings you some peace. I ask God's forgiveness." At 9:09 p.m., 2,500 volts surged through the body of a man who once earned medals for valor. The chair silenced the war hero turned killer. Case 5. The Soldier's Rage, George Cordova. Executed, March 23, 1999. George Cordova served in the U.S. Army. Discipline was drilled into him, but something fractured. In 1985, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Cordova erupted in a drunken rage at the home of his ex-girlfriend, Patricia Martinez. When her friend, 24-year-old Jacqueline Criazzo, tried to intervene, Cordova turned his fury on her. He stabbed Criazzo 26 times in a frenzied attack, then turned the knife on Martinez, stabbing her 13 times. Miraculously, Martinez survived to testify. Criazzo did not. Cordova was convicted and sentenced to death. New Mexico carried out the sentence. He declined a last meal. Strapped to the gurney, his final words were brief and offered no comfort to Jacqueline Criazzo's loved ones. "I'm sorry for what I'd done. I hope God forgives me. I'm ready." At 9:21 p.m., George Cordova, the soldier whose rage turned deadly, died by lethal injection. Case 6. The Airman's Double Life, Lewis Jones, Jr. Executed, March 18, 2003. Master Sergeant Lewis Jones, Jr. presented a perfect facade. A 22-year Air Force veteran, Gulf War service, decorated, respected, a family man. But beneath the uniform lay a monster. In 1995, near Fort Bliss, Texas, Jones abducted 19-year-old Army Private Tracy McBride from her barracks. He raped her, beat her savagely with a tire iron, and left her body in an abandoned building. Her skull was fractured in 14 places. Jones was convicted under federal law and sentenced to death. He became the first person executed by the federal government since 1963. His last meal was a final indulgence: T-bone steak, medium, fried chicken breast, BBQ ribs, onion rings, French fries, cinnamon rolls, peach cobbler, and sweet tea. His final statement was lengthy, expressing love for his family, faith in God, and an apology. "To the McBride family, I am sorry. I know my death won't bring Tracy back. I hope my death brings you peace." He then sang a hymn. At 7:08 a.m., Lewis Jones, Jr., the decorated airman who shattered a young soldier's life, was pronounced dead. The federal government had delivered its verdict. Case 7. The Vietnam Shadow, James D. Clark. Executed, November 9, 1999. James Clark carried Vietnam like a shrapnel wound in his soul. His service left him broken, haunted by PTSD long before the term was widely understood. Back in Florida, the demons won. In 1983, in a horrific act of violence seemingly disconnected from any motive but inner torment, Clark murdered 10-year-old Krista Lee McClelland. He stabbed her multiple times and left her body in a wooded area near her home. The randomness and the brutality shattered a community. Clark was convicted and sentenced to death. Florida executed him. His final meal was simple: steak, baked potato, salad, and tea. His final words acknowledged the unfathomable pain he caused. "I'd like to apologize to the McClelland family. I know my words can't bring Krista back. I hope my death brings them some closure. I'm sorry." At 7:13 p.m., James Clark, a life fractured by war, who inflicted an unforgivable scar on an innocent life, died by lethal injection. Case 8. The Soldier's Bomb, Timothy McVeigh. Executed, June 11, 2001. Timothy McVeigh served as a U.S. Army infantryman during the Gulf War, earning a Bronze Star for his role in the Battle of Norfolk. But the discipline of military service curdled into extremist ideology. On April 19, 1995, McVeigh detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The explosion killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured over 600 others, marking the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history at the time. Arrested 90 minutes after the attack, McVeigh was convicted on federal murder and conspiracy charges. He waived all appeals, calling his death sentence state-assisted suicide. His final meal was 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Strapped to the gurney in Terre Haute, Indiana, McVeigh offered no last words but handed prison officials a handwritten copy of the poem Invictus. His final documented statement echoed its closing line, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." At 7:14 a.m., the decorated soldier turned mass murderer died by federal lethal injection. From Slovic's frozen post to McVeigh's silent gurney, 8 men who wore the uniform then shattered its sacred trust. Fear, savagery, wars haunting ghosts, medals drowned in blood, rage unleashed, the double life, the bomb. Their service stands in records, their crimes scream from graves. The state's response was one of lethal finality. The protector who becomes a predator forfeits all claim to mercy. The uniform cannot absolve the unforgivable.